You've been following what's been going on here with DCYF and DSHS and questions about child care facilities.
Yes.
There's been a call for an outside audit of DCYF and the funding for these child care facilities. You've got a lot of experience with this and audits. If you were designing an audit of DCYF today, what would be the single most important question you'd be trying to answer?
Well, I think on behalf of taxpayers, with as much as the fraud word has been thrown around, we would first of all engage our fraud examiners and that team and get them to work on this.
I mean, how do you even begin to study an agency that big when we're talking about billions of dollars that goes into this?
Well, yeah, we had taken on big ones before, but I think what you want to do is figure out who authorizes these disbursements, and why the inequality, why huge amounts if you've got 3 kids in a daycare versus a much smaller amount if you've got 60 kids in a daycare. What are those factors, and find out who's responsible for those disbursements and making those decisions, and start there.
Is that a relatively easy question to answer?
Yeah, that one is, because it's pretty easy to figure out who's responsible by asking who's responsible and getting that answer, and then go find out if those disbursements are following the letter of the law as provided. Those are federal funds that come into the state, and then they are dispersed by the state agency to folks who ideally are eligible for daycare services. And why the discrepancy in amounts, some high, some low, some not, what goes into that decision making. And again, I think that ought to be pretty simple to backtrack and find out. I don't think anybody's alleging fraud, but you hear that word so often that in any public position, you want to be able to make sure on behalf of the public that their public dollars are being safeguarded.
When we talk about an audit, I mean, there's multiple things that can go under that umbrella.
Sure.
Multiple things, like a financial audit, a compliance audit, a performance audit, and a full-on investigation. In this particular case, knowing what you know from the outside, what do you think is the most appropriate type of audit to address these concerns people might have with DCYF?
I think a financial compliance audit to trace where this money is coming from, where it's going, and why. And I think that can get you in quicker with the most resources available, regardless of who's doing the audit. If the State Auditor's office is doing it, if it's a federal agency who does this because these are federal dollars, whoever does it, I think a financial compliance audit before you get into performance or anything more complicated.
And since you know this system, having been a state auditor, there are people asking for an outside audit, a third party. I mean, there's a state auditor, there's DCYF, there's DSHS, there's multiple organizations here. Is there a need for another entity to come in, or does the state already have the resources to do that?
Well, there shouldn't be. The state does have the resources, and the state has independent functions. I mean, there is no more independent agency than the Washington State Auditor. They work directly for the people of the state, not hired by the legislature or by the governor. That's an elected office, and that's who that office is accountable to.
Is there some confusion here because at a certain point, DSHS, there was a spin-off with DCYF and two different agencies, and one's like supposed to manage fraud and the other one's supposed to manage the implementation of these grants. From where you sit as somebody who's experienced in state government, I mean, is that added to some of this confusion?
Well, I'm sure it does. But in the meantime, while they're trying to figure out who's responsible for which end somebody needs to come in and do that compliance work, that financial audit, and just get moving. You know, where are the dollars? How'd they get here? Where are they going? And why?
What should lawmakers and the public not expect an audit to answer?
Probably not to answer if there was fraud, who committed it. I think that's going to take a little bit different look. But let's get these other financial questions answered.
So you've got a lot of experience with auditing contracts, Washington State Department of Transportation. That was a famous headline-grabbing case.
Sure.
So what do you look for first when trying to determine if there's waste? Is it contracts, administration, placement, service delivery?
Yes. But what you're looking for is in those regulations, you're looking for compliance. You know, again, what was authorized, who authorized it, where did it go, and why.
And what do you look for to determine whether DCYF is actually getting the value from these contracted providers?
Well, I think you're going to find that out when you can answer the question of how much expenditure was authorized, who authorized it.
And in an audit like this, and again, we're very early on in this
Sure.
whole idea, are there red flags that come up immediately in an audit?
Well, I mean, you'll know right away if these regulations are being complied with or not. If they are, you just go on to the next one. If they aren't, you ask why and figure that out.
One of the things that comes out of an investigation, and again, prefacing this by we're very early on in this, but DCYF, if they are examined for just the payouts from grants and the amount of kids that are there, what internal controls should a state agency have to prevent paying for services not delivered?
They should have an internal check and balance on just that, on those disbursements, on when the money comes in, how is it allocated? What are the requirements to disperse? Is it based on a number of kids in a daycare or projections? You know, and I don't know those without reading those contracts, but I think that's what you want to ask and answer first.
When you looked at the Washington State Department of Transportation,
Mm-hmm.
is there one thing that comes to mind that you think could be applied to this situation?
Well, again, I think first of all is compliance. With DOT, we had issues of change orders and what that did to projected costs.
If you're auditing, if the auditor's office or another agency comes into play here and tries to see or makes a assessment of a problem,
Mm-hmm.
Where does that start? Is that because of the statute? Is that because of management? Is it because of interagency coordination?
Oh boy, it could be all of that, or any of it. Somebody needs to, be the bully pulpit, be the official in charge. You know, whether it's the governor or legislative committee or however that works out. But somebody's got to be in a position to direct this.
And that leads into my next question is, I talked to the Attorney General yesterday about
Yes.
what the status of the AG's office investigation may be, whether it can handle an investigation versus defending an agency at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And he made the point that he's not an investigating agency, that would go to local law enforcement, that there are procedures and policies in place
Right.
for that. So who ultimately should be trying to figure out if there's something wrong?
Well, I'll use our office as an example again. If we uncovered a fraud or a misappropriation someplace and reported that to that local law enforcement agency, and they then did an investigation, it would then get referred either to local prosecutors, or sometimes the state attorney general. Could be either.
And these are not things that happen overnight.
No, these are things, and evidently have been going on for a while. When I looked at some of the reports of how much money was being allocated to certain individuals or daycares over a period of 5 months, and then how little comparatively was being allocated to a daycare over 2 or 3 years, there's a lot of questions.
I mean, what's a reasonable timeline to expect that people are actually going to get some answers out of this? I mean, these audits, I read through audits from the State Auditor's office, and these are months long,
Yeah.
or perhaps years long.
Well, I think from beginning to the issuance of an audit report, you're looking at sometimes a significant period of time. But you would also, I think, when you take on something like this that isn't just part of the state single audit, or we're auditing all the different state agencies. This is a special investigation, we would call it, and so we'd be able to provide information incrementally as we go along.
In your experience at the state level, I mean, what are the issues that pop up in human? Let me say that again. In your experience and your tenure at the state, what are the issues that often show up in human services agencies in terms of the money and when you dig deep on this stuff?
Sometimes an agency like this would be in such a hurry to get money out the door to help people. Process and procedures and compliance gets ignored or left out. Now, if those are the answers to some of these questions, those are much more easily fixed and repaired. If it's not, if it's something bigger than that, and again, these are huge dollar amounts, you need to know that too, and that would take a little more time and much more digging.
What's the biggest misconception you think the public has about audits and accountability of government agencies?
Oh, I think a lot of people think that it's the fox watching the hen house, that any audit function that's already part of government is just going to protect its own. But I think they read that wrong when it comes to the State Auditor's office. That's a very independent office, and again, doesn't work for the legislature or the governor's office. It's an independently elected office, and therefore works directly for the people of the state.
That if they find something wrong, can be forwarded to law enforcement.
Yes. In fact, we always made it that we would report our work directly to, if it was a case like that, directly to law enforcement, directly to the appropriate government authority, if it's a local city council or county commissioners, or to a legislature or the governor, but we would also be reporting directly to the public. And that, I think, was the most important part of any report we issued.
What do you wish reporters or lawmakers would ask auditors more often? Because I think a lot of people just look at public records that are on a website and say, oh, something's wrong here, but never ask a follow-up question. What do you, as somebody who sat in this role, what do you think reporters, lawmakers, others should ask auditors more often?
Sometimes you might just want to ask, how big a deal is this? And hopefully you don't get a bureaucratic, long legalistic response to that. You get somebody who'll answer it, like if you're talking to your next door neighbor, or your dad was to ask you, well, Chris, how big a deal is this? And you just tell them.
And it sounds like from where you sit, as somebody who's experienced with looking at numbers and state numbers, even from the outside, you think it sounds like that there's some questions here.
Well, there are questions, and I'm not saying they aren't answerable, but you don't know until you get the answers. And the fact that there are other states involved with similar questions, I don't know how similar or what the relationships might be, but the public, as well as state government, certainly needs answers. They expect demand and deserve answers to these questions.
I think as far as questions, that's what I had. I was just actually hoping for clarity on one of the OFM auditor, because you could read this document better than I can, in terms of there was an OFM audit for all the agencies done in 2024, 1,000 pages,
Yeah.
every agency. And so I look at this and I'll hand it to you, and feel free to read it over before saying anything. But with DCYF, it talks about these 9-figure numbers, almost $500 million in these two programs. But when I read through this, it doesn't necessarily suggest that anything wrong happened. It's just saying that they didn't have the internal controls or comply with requirements to ensure payments to child care providers were allowable and properly supported. So look at this, let me know what your read is on it.
Well, the first thing, that's going on 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So I would think if it was an issue of having internal controls, that those would be put in place. And so you'd be able to look immediately to see if those controls have been put in place. What's their response to it now? Again, these are huge numbers, and I'm sure OFM is looking at these and wanting the same kind of answers.
But a document like that doesn't necessarily suggest that the money was wasted. It's just saying, is it not that they didn't feel on the audit that there were proper controls and that remedy was being taken? Am I reading that the right way?
Well, you are, and like we said earlier, you get into social programs, and sometimes they're in a rush to get money out the door, and their goal is to get this money out and go help people. But at the same time, you've got to be accountable over those dollars and be able to demonstrate to the public the controls in place to safeguard that public money.
And DCYF at this point says they're not paying anybody's bills unless they get an accounting from those providers, and that's on a monthly basis.
Okay, well,
which
good.
is what the Trump administration just suggested to 5 different states today, not named Washington. But DCYF has said that that's how they pay these things out as it stands.
Well, and that would make sense, because I think the original request comes from the individual clients, if you will, seeking financial support for the daycare, and it could be senior homes too, but
Yeah.
that the request comes from them, and then the expenditure has to be tied back to actual expenditures, and that's got to meet certain criteria.
Is there a lot of room for misinterpretation here with what's going on, given the amount of dollars and the amount of providers that we're talking about?
Sure there is. And again, that goes back to why the transparency is so important. Again, the public is asking these questions. Citizens are asking these questions. They deserve answers. Let's go get them answers.
If you wanted to take one more look at that,
Yeah.
I meant to show that to you before we started.
Well,
Because I read through it as, okay, here's all the money that they have dealt with these two programs, but it doesn't necessarily suggest anything was
no, it
misappropriated.
says, grant level adjustments between allowable grant sources to properly spend grant dollars within the allowable period of performance and ensure. See, this is, you can't read this stuff.
Well, and that's
we always had we came up with an executive summary to any audit report that we wrote in very plain, understandable English, so that anybody, a reporter, a citizen, anybody could pick it up, read that, and know what went on. I know you got to get into some of this in a report, but
But that's how it gets, that's how it gets misinterpreted, right? That it's part of an audit and there's this money. And
Or it
says
gets
there's no-
that.
And it says there's
I
no.
can't read that.
Yeah, and it says there's no controls.
Right, so get some
So
controls.
somebody then says, okay, well, this was all money that was misused, but that's not what that's saying.
No, but so when do you do the follow-up? You know, when are they required to put those controls in place? I would think that would happen pretty quickly. You know, if I was responsible for that much money in my agency, and the auditor came along and said, well, you know, it seems okay, but there's no controls over this. You don't have internal controls. Well, the first thing I would do is make sure we put a system of internal controls over how that's processed and handled. And then go, whew, glad they pointed that out to us.
Yeah.
Otherwise, they're going to come along at their next, this is for a fiscal year ended 24, ended June of 24. Well, we're not that far away from the next one. Is the next one going to say the same thing? Or have they implemented and those controls?